I showed up on time, signed the papers I was told to sign, and paid every bill they handed me because that's what responsible adults do. On Tuesday morning, at 9:17 a.m., someone else made a decision about my name without asking me. Nothing dramatic happened at first. A coffee went cold. A door stayed closed a little too long. I noticed my keycard still worked, but my access didn't. By the end of that day, I realized the rules I trusted were never written for me, and they were about to be enforced. I learned early that if you do everything by the book, people stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a line item. I'm not saying that bitterly. It's just something you notice after enough mornings begin the same way. Alarm at 5:30 a.m. Black coffee. Keys in the same ceramic bowl by the door, and a drive that takes exactly 23 minutes if the light at Route 9 cooperates. I did what I was supposed to do. I showed up. I documented everything. I paid on time. And for years, that was enough. I live in Aurora, Colorado, on the edge of a subdivision where the houses all look like they were stamped out of the same mold and then painted slightly different shades of beige so no one could accuse them of being identical. I work as a compliance analyst for a regional property management company. It's not glamorous. It's spreadsheets, checklists, municipal codes, and making sure someone else's promises line up with what the law actually says. I'm good at it. I like the quiet logic of it. Rules don't play favorites. At least, that's what I believed. On Tuesday morning, at 9:17 a.m., I was sitting at my desk with a legal pad open to a fresh page. I had written the date at the top out of habit. I was halfway through an email to the city clerk about a permit discrepancy when my inbox refreshed. One new message. No subject line. Just my name in the greeting, spelled correctly, which I remember noticing because most people get it wrong. The message was short. 3 sentences. Polite, neutral, informational. It said there had been a structural update to the account I oversaw. It said the change was effective immediately. It said there was no action required on my end. No action required is one of those phrases that sounds like relief until you realize it usually means you've already been removed from the equation. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Around me, the office hummed the way it always did. The printer coughed out a stack of reports. Someone down the hall laughed at something on their phone. The HVAC kicked on with a low rattle. Nothing about the room acknowledged that anything had shifted. I minimized the email and opened the internal dashboard. The login page accepted my password on the first try. The home screen loaded. My name was still in the corner. That should have reassured me. Instead, I clicked into the account I'd managed for 3 years, the one with the tight margins, the picky HOA board, the monthly audits I never missed. The Access tab was grayed out. I refreshed. Same result. I checked another account. Fine. A third. Fine. Just that one. Isolated. Clean. Surgical. I didn't panic. That's important. Panic implies surprise. And on some level, I wasn't surprised. There had been signs. Small ones. Easy to explain away if you didn't want to make trouble. Like the meeting last Friday that was rescheduled without my calendar updating, or the call I was forwarded late after decisions had already been made, or the way my manager, Brent, had started ending conversations with, "We'll circle back," and never did. None of it was overt. Nothing you could point to and say, "There, that's it." It was more like standing in a room where the temperature drops a degree at a time until you realize your hands are cold. I took my coffee mug to the break room and topped it off. The pot was almost empty, and the burner had scorched that burnt metal smell into the air. I poured anyway. At the sink, I noticed the soap dispenser was still broken, so I pumped it twice and nothing came out. I rinsed my hands under water that never quite got hot. It felt like a detail worth remembering, though I didn't know why yet. Back at my desk, I sent a message to IT. Short, factual. I included a screenshot, then I waited. Waiting is something you get good at in my line of work. Waiting for signatures, waiting for approvals, waiting for someone to admit they made a mistake. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I checked my sent folder to make sure the message had gone through. It had. Delivered. Read. At 9:52 a.m., Brent appeared in the doorway of my cubicle. He didn't step inside. He leaned on the partition with one hand, casual, like he was about to ask me about my weekend. "Hey," he said. "You got a minute?" I saved my file and stood up. "Sure." He gestured toward the small conference room near the windows. As we walked, I noticed he didn't bring his laptop or a notebook. He didn't bring anything at all. The room smelled faintly like dry erase markers and lemon cleaner. Sunlight slanted across the table, catching dust motes in the air. Brent sat across from me and folded his hands. He smiled the way people do when they're trying to look approachable while delivering information they don't intend to negotiate. "So," he said, drawing the word out. "We made a few adjustments this morning." I waited. Silence can be useful if you let it sit long enough. "The HOA account," he continued. "We're restructuring oversight, streamlining, you know how it is." I nodded slowly. I noticed my access was removed. "Right," he said, too quickly. "That's part of it. Temporary." I'm said. "How temporary?" I asked. He tilted his head, considering. "Hard to say. Depends how things shake out." I looked at him. Really looked. His tie was slightly crooked. There was a coffee stain on his sleeve, dried and faint. He hadn't noticed either. "Who's overseeing it now?" I asked. Another pause. This one longer. "That's still being finalized." That was when I understood this wasn't about efficiency, or streamlining, or anything neutral. This was about control. About deciding who needed to be in the room when choices were made, and who didn't. "I wasn't informed," I said. I kept my voice even. "That account has compliance deadlines this week." Brent smiled again. "We've got it covered." That phrase landed heavier than it should have. We've got it covered. Not I, not the team. We. A collective I wasn't part of. The meeting ended without a clear next step. No timeline, no documentation. I walked back to my desk and sat down. My key card still worked when I came back from lunch. My email still opened. My name was still on the door. But something essential had been moved out of reach, quietly, while I was doing what I always did, trusting the process. At 12:30 p.m., my phone buzzed with a notification from the HOA portal. An automated alert. There had been a filing update. I clicked it out of reflex. The document was stamped with today's date, a revised authorization form. My name was still there, printed neatly in black ink. Right below it, in a different font, was another name I didn't recognize, and next to mine, in blue, was a digital note. "Removed per directive." No explanation, no initials, just a directive, as if that settled it. I closed the app and set my phone face down on the desk. Around me, the office kept moving. People talked about lunch plans. Someone complained about traffic. A delivery cart rattled past. I sat there and thought about all the rules I'd followed without question. All the times I'd told myself that staying quiet was the same as being professional. That if you did good work, the rest would sort itself out. By the end of that day, I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I drove home the same route, parked in the same spot, unlocked my front door with the same key. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning. But the trust I'd built my life around the idea that fairness was automatic if you earned it had already started to crack. I didn't know yet how far it would go. I only knew that something had been taken from me without a fight, and I was about to find out what it would cost to get it back. By the next morning, nothing had been resolved, which in my experience usually meant a decision had already hardened into place. I woke up before my alarm, the dark outside still heavy and quiet, and lay there listening to the furnace kick on and off. It was late October, the kind of Colorado cold that sneaks in overnight and makes the house feel unfamiliar for a few seconds after you open your eyes. I stared at the ceiling and ran through my day before it started, like I always did. Meetings. Reports. A call with the county assessor at noon. The rhythm steadied me. I got up, showered, dressed, and packed my lunch. Turkey sandwich, apple, the same blue ice pack I'd had since grad school. On the counter, my phone buzzed once with a notification from work email. I didn't open it. Not yet. I wanted to pretend, just for the drive, that Tuesday had been a glitch. an awkward miscommunication that would smooth itself out if I stayed calm and reasonable. The drive to the office took 25 minutes that morning. A stalled pickup near the on-ramp slowed things down. I waited, foot on the brake, watching exhaust curl into the cold air. A billboard on the side of the road advertised a personal injury lawyer with a smiling face and a phone number in red. Justice is just a call away. I remember thinking how optimistic that sounded. When I pulled into the parking lot, Brent's car was already there. So was the silver SUV that belonged to Diane from operations. That wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was the unfamiliar black sedan parked near the entrance, its windows tinted darker than the rest. It didn't mean anything. It could have been a client. A vendor, I noted it anyway. Inside, the office smelled like fresh carpet cleaner, sharp and chemical. Someone must have scheduled it overnight. I swiped my keycard. The green light blinked on, still valid. The small reassurance barely registered before my email chimed again. This time, I opened it. It was a calendar invite for a meeting at 10. Hey OA Oversight Alignment. Required attendees were listed beneath. Brent, Diane. 2 names from legal. My name wasn't there. I stared at the screen, waiting for it to update, for my inbox to refresh and correct itself. It didn't. I checked the room reservation. The big conference room with the windows. The one with the speakerphone that always echoed. That was where decisions happened, even when they were framed as discussions. I'd been in that room dozens of times, explaining compliance risks, pointing out small details that saved the company big fines later. I knew the cadence. I knew the tone people used when they wanted agreement, not input. At 9:58, I walked past the room on my way to the printer. The door was open. Papers were spread out on the table. A yellow legal pad sat at Brent's usual spot, already scribbled with notes. I slowed just enough to see Diane adjusting the blinds, her back to the hall. She glanced up and met my eyes. For a split second, something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe, or calculation. Then she smiled. "Morning," she said, brightly. Too brightly. "Morning," I replied, and kept walking. At my desk, I printed the reports I'd planned to review with the county assessor. The machine whirred and spat them out. I stacked the pages neatly, aligning the corners. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I felt like I should be angrier, or at least rattled. Instead, there was a tight, focused calm settling in, the kind that comes when you realize you're no longer part of the conversation you've been preparing for. At noon, I dialed into the assessor's office call. The clerk on the other end recognized my name immediately. "Good to hear from you," she said. I was wondering who'd be calling about that discrepancy. "Still me," I said, after a beat. "As far as I know." "It's not way." There was a pause. Not a long one, but enough to register. "We received an update this morning," she said carefully. "New point of contact." My stomach dropped, slow and heavy, like an elevator missing a floor. "Who?" I asked. She hesitated. "I can email you the form if you want. It came through around 9. I thanked her and ended the call. The email arrived seconds later. Same document as the one from the portal. Same note, removed per directive. "Directive from whom?" The question echoed without an answer. I pushed back from my desk and looked around. People were working, typing, laughing quietly at something on a screen. No one looked at me. No one avoided looking at me either. It was as if I'd already been erased from a version of events they were all participating in without realizing it. At 12:47, Brent emerged from the conference room. He caught sight of me standing by the printer and waved me over, like nothing was wrong. "Hey," he said. "You got a sec?" Again. We stepped into the hallway. He leaned against the wall this time, crossing his arms. "So," he said. "About the HOA account." I waited. "We're shifting some responsibilities around," he continued. "Higher-level oversight." "I wasn't aware oversight was lacking," I said. He chuckled softly, as if I'd made a joke. "It's not about that. It's about optics." "Optics," I repeated. "Board relationships, stakeholders, you know." I did know. Optics meant image, comfort, familiar faces, People who looked right in rooms full of other people who thought they knew better. "I've been the point of contact for 3 years," I said. "There haven't been violations." "No one's questioning your work," he said quickly. "This isn't a performance issue." "Then what was it?" The question hung between us, unspoken. He checked his watch. "Look, let's touch base next week, see how things settle." Next week. Another circle back. Another delay dressed up as patience. That afternoon, I opened a folder on my computer I hadn't touched in months. It was labeled simply, Notes. Inside were dated entries. Not official documentation, just observations. Times meetings had shifted. Comments that had been phrased oddly. Small inconsistencies I'd noticed and then dismissed because it was easier not to connect them. I scrolled through, reading my own words like they belonged to someone else. At the time, they'd felt paranoid. Now, they felt precise. At 4:30, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. She lives in Kansas City, works in nonprofit fundraising. "We don't talk every day, but we check in." "How's work?" she wrote. I stared at the screen. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. The meetings, the access removal, the quiet decisions. Instead, I typed, "Busy. Weird week." She responded with a thumbs up and a smiley face. I set the phone down. When I got home that evening, the porch light was already on. I don't remember turning it on in the morning. Maybe I had. Or maybe the timer kicked in earlier because the days were getting shorter. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly like the lemon cleaner I used on Sundays. Everything was where it should be. I kicked off my shoes and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a neighbor's TV through the wall. I thought about how much of my life was built on systems I trusted without ever seeing who controlled them. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept dreaming about locked doors that opened just enough to let light through, but not enough to step inside. Every time I woke up, the same thought surfaced, clearer than the last. Whatever was happening wasn't an accident, and whoever decided I was expendable had done it quietly, assuming I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I'd notice and do nothing. They were wrong about one of those things. By Thursday, the pattern had settled in enough that I could trace its outline without forcing it to make sense. Things weren't disappearing all at once. They were being thinned out, shaved down to the essentials, like someone sanding a surface smooth while insisting nothing had changed. That morning, I arrived to find my inbox lighter than usual. Not empty, just missing certain threads. The long email chains that tended to run for weeks, the ones where decisions quietly evolved, were no longer reaching me. I searched for one by subject line. Nothing. I searched by sender. Still nothing. I tried an older message I knew I'd replied to. It came up, but the replies after mine stopped abruptly, as if the conversation had ended the moment I spoke. I checked the settings. Filters hadn't changed. Nothing was being routed elsewhere. The absence wasn't technical, it was intentional. At 8:40 a.m., I got a message from it. Short, polite. It said my earlier request about access limitations had been forwarded to management. No timeline, no ticket number, just a digital shrug. I replied with a thank you and closed the chat window. Across the aisle, Diane laughed at something Brent said. They were standing too close, heads angled toward each other in that way people do when they think they're alone. I wasn't eavesdropping. Their voices carried. "Already signed off," Brent said. Diane nodded. "Good, saves us the back and forth." I didn't hear my name. That didn't comfort me. It confirmed what I was beginning to understand. I didn't need to be discussed anymore. At 9:15, I opened the shared drive where we stored policy updates. A new folder had appeared overnight. Revised oversight. I clicked into it. My name appeared once, buried in a reference document, followed by the word former. Former what, exactly, wasn't specified. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, unevenly. One of them flickered, just enough to catch my attention, then steadied again. It reminded me of the soap dispenser in the break room. Not broken enough to fix, just inconvenient enough to get used to. At 10, I attended a meeting I hadn't been disinvited from yet. It was a small one, just 3 of us and a speakerphone. The agenda was routine. As I spoke, explaining a compliance nuance I'd flagged months earlier, I noticed something strange. No one interrupted me. No one asked follow-up questions. They nodded politely, eyes drifting to their screens. When I finished, there was a pause. Then one of the legal reps cleared his throat. "We'll take that under advisement," he said. That phrase used to mean something. Now it felt like a door closing softly. After the call, I gathered my notes and returned to my desk. A man I didn't recognize was standing there, scrolling through something on his tablet. Mid-40s. Crisp button-down. Visitor badge clipped neatly to his belt. "Oh," he said, looking up. "Sorry, I was told to grab a copy of the audit summary." I blinked. "Who told you?" He hesitated. "Brent. I can send it," I said. He smiled apologetically. He said it'd be quicker if I stopped by. I forwarded the file anyway. As it sent, I noticed my name wasn't on the header anymore. The document looked cleaner without it, less cluttered. The man thanked me and walked away. He didn't introduce himself. I didn't ask. At lunch, I sat at my desk and ate my sandwich. Halfway through, my phone buzzed with a notification from the building's security app. Access update. That was new. I opened it. Temporary restriction applied to after-hours access, it read. Contact administration with questions. It's also the devrement. After-hours access wasn't something I used often, but it was the principle of it that landed wrong. No one had mentioned it. No one had asked if I needed it. I forwarded the notification to Brent with a simple message. "Is this related to the oversight changes?" He didn't respond. By mid-afternoon, the small details began to stack up. My name was missing from a draft agenda pinned to the corkboard near the copier. A vendor emailed me directly, confused about a change in contact, and then apologized when I replied, saying they'd been told to go another direction. A calendar reminder I'd set months ago vanished without explanation. None of it was dramatic on its own. That was the point. Each thing could be brushed aside, explained away as an oversight, a timing issue, a miscommunication. Together, they formed something else entirely. At 3:10 p.m. my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Local. "Hello?" I answered. "This is Marlene from the HOA board," the voice said. "I'm calling because we received an email this morning that raised some concerns." I straightened. "What kind of concerns?" She lowered her voice, as if someone might be listening on her end. "It said you were no longer authorized to speak on behalf of the management company." We were surprised. I was too, I said truthfully. There was a pause. "You've always been very thorough," she said. "That's why I wanted to call you directly." "Did the email specify a reason?" I asked. "No," she said. "Just that oversight had been reassigned. We were told to direct questions elsewhere." "Who sent it?" I asked. She hesitated. "It came from legal, signed digitally." I thanked her for calling and hung up. My hands were cold. I noticed because the air in the office was warm, almost stuffy. I flexed my fingers and looked down at them, as if they might tell me something I was missing. At 4:45, Brent finally replied to my message from earlier. "Let's discuss tomorrow," he wrote. No explanation. No acknowledgement. Just another delay. That evening, as I packed up to leave, I noticed a small white envelope on my desk. No name, no stamp, just placed there, deliberately. Inside was a printed memo, 1 page. The letterhead belonged to the company. It outlined a temporary role realignment and referenced strategic alignment with external stakeholders. My position wasn't mentioned by title. My name appeared once, at the bottom, under impacted personnel. Impacted. Not informed. Not consulted. Impacted. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into my bag. As I stood to leave, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I looked the same. Tired, maybe. Focused. Nothing about me suggested I was in the middle of being edged out of my own work. The drive home felt longer than usual. Traffic was light, but my thoughts were loud. I replayed the day in pieces, fitting them together like fragments of a puzzle someone else had already solved. At a red light, I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 6:02 p.m. The radio murmured softly. A commercial came on, cheerful and insistent, promising peace of mind for a low monthly rate. When I pulled into my driveway, my porch light flicked on automatically. I stood there for a moment before getting out of the car, watching moths circle the bulb, drawn to something bright they didn't understand. Inside, I dropped my bag on the chair and went straight to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. My hands had stopped shaking. That worried me more than if they hadn't. I sat at the table and pulled the folded memo from my bag. I read it again, line by line. Then I took out my notebook, the one I used for personal notes, not work, and wrote down everything that had happened that day. Times, names, phrases, not interpretations, just facts. Halfway through, I realized I wasn't writing to make sense of it anymore. I was writing to remember it exactly as it was, before anyone tried to tell me it hadn't happened at all. Friday was the first day something happened in front of witnesses. Up until then, everything had been quiet enough to feel deniable. Emails, access, permissions, words like temporary and alignment floating around without ever landing anywhere solid. If I said something, I would sound defensive. If I pushed, I would look emotional. That calculus had kept me still. Friday removed that option. It started with an all-hands meeting scheduled for 10:30 a.m. The invite came late Thursday evening, after I'd already shut my laptop. Mandatory attendance, no agenda. That alone was unusual. All-hands meetings were usually announced days in advance, with bullet points and talking points prepared. This one felt rushed, like it had been added because someone realized something needed to be said out loud. I arrived early and took a seat near the middle of the room. Not the front, not the back. A neutral position. Around me, people chatted quietly, phones in hand, coffee cups balanced on knees. Brent stood near the projector, talking to someone from legal. Diane sat in the front row, scrolling through her tablet. At 10:32, Brent cleared his throat. "Thanks for making time this morning," he said. "I'll keep this brief." The lights dimmed slightly as the screen lit up behind him. A slide appeared with the company logo and the words, "Operational Update," in a clean sans serif font. "We've been reviewing some internal processes," he continued, "and as part of that, we've made a few strategic adjustments." My pulse ticked up, slow and steady. "This is about ensuring consistency," he said. "Clarity, stronger relationships with external partners." He clicked to the next slide. A simple org chart appeared. Boxes, lines, names. My name wasn't there. At first, I thought I was missing it, that it was tucked somewhere unexpected. I scanned the chart again, more carefully. Compliance was still listed. Oversight was still listed. The role I'd occupied informally, maybe, but clearly had been absorbed into a new box, labeled Senior Advisory Liaison. Next to it was Diane's name. No explanation. No footnote. Just a clean reassignment, presented as if it had always been that way. Brent kept talking. "As part of this realignment," he said, "we'll be streamlining points of contact. This should reduce redundancy and improve efficiency." He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone in particular. His gaze stayed fixed on the room as a whole, as if he were addressing a concept rather than people. "Day-to-day workflows won't change for most of you," he added. "If you have questions, feel free to follow up offline." Offline. Later. Somewhere private. I felt eyes on me then. Not all of them. Just enough. Curious glances. Quick looks that slid away as soon as I met them. No one said anything. No one raised a hand. The meeting ended with polite applause. Chairs scraped back. Conversations resumed, louder now, as if sound itself could smooth over what had just happened. Diane stood and walked past me on her way out. She paused. "I meant to tell you," she said softly, leaning in. "This isn't personal." I looked up at her. "Then what is it?" She smiled, the same practice smile she used with vendors. "It's just how things go sometimes." Then she straightened and walked away. I stayed seated for a moment longer than necessary. My hands were resting on my thighs. I noticed a faint crease in my slacks where I'd folded my leg earlier. The room smelled like coffee and dry carpet. Someone laughed near the door. When I finally stood, my legs felt steady. Too steady. I walked back to my desk and sat down. My inbox refreshed automatically. No new messages. At 11:07, an email arrived from legal. It was addressed to the full compliance team. Subject: Updated communication protocols. The body was brief. It outlined new guidelines for external correspondence. All communications regarding HOA oversight were to be routed through the Senior Advisory Liaison. Questions outside that scope should be escalated accordingly. My name wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. At lunch, I ate with a fork balanced on the edge of my desk. I wasn't hungry, but the act of eating grounded me. Across the aisle, a coworker named Josh hesitated near my cubicle. "Hey," he said. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. He nodded, shifting his weight. "That meeting was unexpected." "That's one word for it," I said. He opened his mouth, then closed it. "If you need anything." "I know," I said. "Thanks." He walked away, relief visible in the set of his shoulders. He'd done what politeness required. No more, no less. At 2:15, I received a forwarded email from a vendor. The original message, sent to Diane, referenced a conversation I'd supposedly had with them the week before. I hadn't. The details were wrong, timelines skewed, decisions attributed to me that I would never have approved. I forwarded it back with a simple note. This wasn't me. An hour later, Diane replied, copying Brent. "Thanks for flagging. Already handled. Already handled. No correction. No clarification." By mid-afternoon, the quiet humiliation had settled in. Not the sharp kind that burns hot and fast, but the slow kind that sinks into your chest and sits there, heavy and unmoving. I wasn't being accused of incompetence. I was being overwritten. At 4 p.m., the office began to thin out. People packed up early, eager for the weekend. I stayed, not because I needed to, but because leaving felt like conceding something I hadn't yet named. At 4:37, my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Saw the org chart. "Are you okay?" It was Marlene from the HOA board. I hadn't given her my personal number. She must have had it already. I stared at the message. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. "I'm fine," I typed, then deleted it. Instead, I wrote, "I'm aware of the change. Thanks for checking in." She replied almost immediately. "If you want to talk, I'm here." I locked my phone and slipped it into my bag. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. When I finally left the office, the sky was already darkening. The air outside was crisp, sharp against my lungs. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel without starting it. For a moment, I let myself feel it fully, the anger, the disbelief, the sting of being dismissed in a room full of people who pretended not to notice. What hurt most wasn't losing the role. It was losing it publicly, without discussion, as if my presence had been provisional all along. As if the years of careful work could be folded away with a slide transition. I drove home in silence. No radio, no podcasts, just the sound of tires on pavement and my own breathing. At home, I changed into sweatpants and stood in the kitchen, staring at the fridge. I wasn't hungry. I poured a glass of water instead and drank it slowly, feeling the cold settle in my stomach. I thought about all the times I'd stayed quiet to keep things smooth. All the moments I'd told myself that professionalism meant absorbing discomfort without reacting. Friday had shown me the cost of that approach. Someone had decided I was small enough to move without asking. They'd done it openly, calmly, and with witnesses. And for the first time since Tuesday morning, I understood something clearly. This wasn't just about what had been taken. It was about what they expected me to accept. Saturday morning arrived without urgency, which felt wrong after the way the week had ended. Sunlight crept through the blinds in thin lines, landing on the wall above my bed. I lay there longer than usual, listening to the quiet of the neighborhood. A lawn sprinkler clicked on somewhere down the block. A car door slammed, ordinary sounds, the kind that usually reassured me. This time, they didn't. I made coffee and stood at the counter while it brewed, watching steam fog the underside of the cabinets. My phone sat face down beside my keys. I hadn't checked my work email since leaving the office. I told myself it could wait until Monday. That whatever had been decided would still be decided in 48 hours. That was the lie I needed to get through the morning. At 8:13 a.m., my phone buzzed anyway. It wasn't email. It was a notification from the HOA portal, the same one I'd received alerts from earlier in the week. I stared at the screen for a second before opening it, bracing myself for another update delivered without context. New filing uploaded. Authorization change, effective immediately. My heart slowed, then thudded harder. I tapped the notification. The document opened slowly, as if my phone were buying me time. It was a scanned PDF, 2 pages long, clean, formal. The kind of form I'd reviewed dozens of times in my career. My eyes went straight to the signature section. There were 2 signatures. One was Diane's. The other was Brent's. Below them, in smaller type, was a statement certifying that all relevant parties had been notified of the change prior to execution. I read that line 3 times. Notified. The form granted full discretionary authority over HOA compliance decisions to the senior advisory liaison role, not oversight, not coordination, authority. It removed the requirement for compliance review before external communication. It also included a clause indemnifying the company against actions taken in good faith by the newly designated representative. Good faith. Another phrase that sounded benign until you knew how often it was used to excuse everything that followed. I scrolled down. My name appeared once, in the section titled Previous Authorization Holders. Next to it was a date, yesterday's date, and a small checkbox marked Revoked. There was no place for my signature. No acknowledgement line. No space for objection. I sat down at the kitchen table, the chair legs scraping loudly against the tile. The coffee maker clicked off behind me. I didn't move to pour a cup. This wasn't just about optics anymore. This wasn't a quiet reassignment or a public reshuffle. This was a legal change, a structural one, the kind that carried consequences beyond hurt feelings or bruised pride. Someone had stripped my authority in writing and certified that I'd been informed when I hadn't. That was the moment the story changed. At 9:02 a.m., I called Marlene. She answered on the second ring. I was hoping you'd call. Did you know about this? I asked, skipping pleasantries. She exhaled. We received the filing last night. It was unexpected. Were you told I'd been notified? I asked. Yes, she said carefully. The email said you were aligned with the change. Aligned. Another word that carried more weight than it admitted. I wasn't, I said. There was a pause on the line. In the background, I could hear the faint sound of a television, weekend news, voices rising and falling. I thought you should know, she said finally. The board is concerned. Concerned how? I asked. She hesitated. About the indemnity clause. And the timing. We've always relied on you to flag issues before they became problems. I closed my eyes. Has anything been flagged yet? Not officially, she said. But there have been conversations. Conversations. Always conversations. We ended the call with a promise to talk again soon. When I set my phone down, my hands were shaking enough that the table rattled softly beneath them. I pressed my palms flat against the wood and waited for it to stop. This wasn't personal anymore. It was procedural, and procedures leave trails. I spent the rest of Saturday doing something I hadn't planned to do. Nothing visible. I ran errands, bought groceries, did laundry, folded socks. I moved through the day on autopilot, my mind replaying the document over and over, examining it from different angles. Who had drafted it? Who had reviewed it? Who had decided to file it on a Friday afternoon, when most people were already mentally gone for the weekend? By Sunday evening, I knew one thing for certain. That authorization change wasn't defensive, it was anticipatory. At 7:46 p.m., as I was loading the dishwasher, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email notification from my personal account. From norapply@countyrecords.gov. I dried my hands on a towel and opened it. The message was automated. A confirmation that a document related to a managed property had been filed under my company's name. It included a link to view the record. I clicked. The page loaded to reveal a permit modification request submitted earlier that afternoon. Same property, same HOA. The request sought approval for a structural variance, one that I knew, without even reading the details, would trigger additional compliance review. Only there was no review attached. The applicant listed was the management company. The point of contact was Diane. The approval checkbox for compliance clearance was marked yes. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. That checkbox wasn't supposed to be checked without documentation, without inspection, without sign-off, without me. I scrolled down. The timestamp read 3:22 p.m. They hadn't just removed me. They'd moved quickly to act without me. I sat back in the chair, the dishwasher humming beside me. For a long moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt cold, clear. The way you do when you finally understand the rules of a game you didn't realize you were playing. This was the event, the real one, not the meeting, not the org chart, not the quiet comments in the hallway. This was a decision that crossed a line. By Monday morning, if this went unchallenged, it wouldn't matter whether I'd been right or wrong about the earlier signs. The record would show a clean handoff, a compliant process, my absence framed as consent. I opened my laptop and created a new folder on my desktop. I named it Timeline. Inside, I started a document and wrote the date at the top. Then I began listing everything, from Tuesday at 9:17 a.m. onward, emails, meetings, messages, filings. I included timestamps, screenshots, exact language, not interpretations, evidence. At 10:04 p.m., my phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. You should probably check the county filings. I stared at the message, then typed back. I have. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Be careful, the reply said. This isn't just internal anymore. I set the phone down and looked at the open document on my screen. The list was already longer than I expected. Longer than it should have been for a single week. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be resolved with a conversation in a hallway or a vague promise to touch base. In Reparode, someone had made a move that couldn't be undone quietly. And now, I had a choice. Do nothing and let the record decide who I was. Or step fully into the role they'd already written me out of and make sure the truth was documented just as clearly as their signatures had been. By the time I closed my laptop, the house was silent again. Outside, the porch light clicked on automatically. I stood in the doorway, looking out at the dark, and understood something with absolute certainty. This wasn't the cost of speaking up. This was the cost of staying silent for too long. Monday didn't begin with confrontation. It began with confirmation. I arrived at the office at 8:12 a.m., earlier than usual. The parking lot was mostly empty, the asphalt still dark from overnight frost. I sat in my car for a moment before getting out, watching my breath fog the windshield as the engine idled. There was a calm in me that hadn't been there the week before. Not peace, clarity. Inside, the lights were already on. The cleaning crew had left the faint smell of disinfectant behind, sharp and lemony. I unlocked my computer, logged in, and opened the timeline folder I'd created the night before. It felt strange seeing it there, so deliberate, like a line I'd crossed without anyone else noticing. Before I did anything else, I checked the county records again. The permit modification request was still pending. No rejection, no flag, no note requesting additional documentation. The system treated it as complete. That shouldn't have been possible. I pulled up the compliance checklist we'd used for years. It was a simple spreadsheet, nothing fancy. Boxes that had to be checked, fields that had to be filled, attachments required before submission. I compared it line by line to the filed request. 3 required attachments were missing. 3. Not optional. Not discretionary. Required. And yet the system showed compliance clearance. Yes. Accuse of hindations. That checkbox wasn't automatic. It had to be manually selected by someone with authority. Authority they had taken from me. At 8:37, I received an email from IT. Subject: Access Update, County Interface. The body was brief. Per management request, your credentials for external filing interfaces have been deactivated. Please direct any questions to administration. I read it twice. Then a third time. Deactivated, not suspended, not under review. Deactivated. They weren't just excluding me anymore. They were closing doors behind themselves. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote down the exact time. Then I added the email to the timeline folder. At 9:05, my phone buzzed. A voicemail notification, unknown number. I stepped into an empty conference room before listening to it. The room was small, windowless, usually reserved for quick calls. The door clicked shut behind me. "Hi," the voice said. Male, calm, slightly rushed. "This is Paul with the contractor's office. I'm following up on the variance approval. We just wanted to confirm we're clear to proceed." Diane said compliance had already signed off. There was a pause. Papers rustled. "She mentioned you were out of the loop now," he added, almost as an afterthought. "So I figured I'd just double-check." I closed my eyes. "Can you call me back?" the message continued. "I want to make sure we're all on the same page." He left his number. I didn't call back right away. Instead, I opened the internal communications log. It was something I'd rarely needed to use a back-end record of system messages and approvals. Most people didn't even know it existed. It wasn't secret, just obscure. Buried 3 menus deep. I searched by date. Friday afternoon. There it was. An internal note attached to the HOA account. Time-stamped 3:14 p.m. Authored by Diane. Compliance review complete. No outstanding issues. No attachment. No checklist. No reference. Just a statement. Below it, a system log entry showed the compliance clearance checkbox being toggled from no to yes at 3:22 p.m. The user ID didn't match Diane's. It matched Brent's. My chest tightened not with panic, but with something colder. Focused. I took screenshots. Carefully. Including the timestamps, the user IDs, the sequence. This wasn't sloppy. It was coordinated. At 10:11, I finally called Paul back. "Hi," I said. "This is the person you were trying to reach." "Oh, great," he said, relief evident. "So we're good to go?" "No," I said simply. "You're not." There was a pause. Diane said. "I know what Diane said," I interrupted, "but compliance clearance was improperly filed." Silence stretched across the line. "What does that mean for us?" he asked. "It means," I said, choosing my words carefully, "that proceeding without proper clearance exposes you and the company to risk." Another pause. "Can you put that in writing?" "Yes," I said. "I can." I hung up and drafted an email. Neutral, precise, no accusations. I outlined the missing documentation, the incorrect clearance, the potential consequences. I CC'd Diane. I CC'd Brent. I cheated legal. Before sending it, I read it once more. Then I added one line at the end. For the record, I was not notified of the authorization change prior to filing. Then I sent it. The response was immediate. Not from Diane. Not from Brent. From legal. Subject, compliance status, HO variance. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We are reviewing internally. Again. At 11:02, Brent appeared at my desk. "We need to talk," he said. "I agree," I replied, standing. This time, he didn't gesture toward a conference room. He walked ahead of me, toward his office. The door closed behind us with a soft click. He didn't sit. Neither did I. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "I didn't make it that way," I said. He ran a hand through his hair. "You're complicating a process that was already resolved." "It wasn't resolved," I said. "It was falsified." His jaw tightened. "Be careful with your language. Be careful with your filings," I replied. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt dense, like a storm about to break. "You're overstepping," he said finally. "I was removed without notice," I said. "Authority was reassigned under false certification. A clearance was filed without documentation. That's not overstepping. That's documentation." He exhaled sharply. "You need to let this go." That was the moment everything clarified. "Why?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Because if this unravels," he said, "it won't stop where you think it will." I held his gaze. "That's not my concern." "It's a?" He looked at me for a long second, then nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "We'll be in touch," he said. I left his office without another word. At 1:30 p.m., I received an email from the county assessor's office. Subject: Compliance Inquiry, HOA Variance. The body was short. We have received a question regarding the compliance clearance attached to the recent filing. Please advise. I forwarded it to legal with a single sentence. This inquiry may relate to the improper clearance noted earlier. By mid-afternoon, the office felt different, quieter. People avoided my eyes. Conversations stopped when I walked past. Not because I was being dramatic, but because something had shifted. They knew. Not the details. Not yet. But they knew this wasn't just about a role change anymore. At 4:18 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Marlene. The board is requesting a formal explanation. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. I'm preparing one. When I finally shut down my computer that evening, the timeline folder was no longer just a record. It was a map. And every path on it led to the same conclusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't politics. It wasn't personality. It was a deliberate bypass of safeguards, ones that existed for a reason. They had assumed I would absorb it quietly. They had assumed that removing my authority would remove my voice. What they hadn't accounted for was this. I knew exactly how the system worked. And now I had proof that someone had used it the wrong way. After Monday, I stopped expecting things to return to normal. That expectation had been the last thing tying me to the version of events they wanted me to accept. Once it was gone, everything sharpened. I didn't confront anyone on Tuesday morning. I didn't send follow-up emails or demand explanations. I showed up, logged in, and did exactly what my job description still technically allowed me to do. I documented, I observed, I listened. That restraint wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. I'd spent enough years in compliance to know that when people sense pressure, they change behavior. They close ranks. They get careful. They stop making mistakes in writing and start making them in hallways and half sentences. If I wanted to understand the full shape of what was happening, I needed them comfortable, confident, certain that the worst had already passed. So I let them believe that. At 8:46 a.m., Diane walked past my desk without looking at me. At 9:10, Brent laughed loudly in his office, the door open, like someone who wanted to be heard enjoying himself. At 9:30, a meeting invite went out for later that afternoon. I wasn't included. I noted the time. Nothing else. By mid-morning, legal sent a brief update. They were continuing to assess the compliance issue. No resolution, no assignment of responsibility, just time. Time was something I could work with. I spent the next hour reviewing historical filings for the HOA account. Not just the recent ones, the older ones, the boring ones, the ones no one revisited unless something went wrong. I compared timelines, sign-off patterns, who approved what, and how often exceptions were made. A pattern emerged. Diane had always been the messenger, the intermediary, the person who framed decisions as consensus. But the actual approvals, the moments where the system shifted from review to execution, almost always traced back to Brent's credentials. He didn't initiate. He authorized. That distinction mattered. At 11:15, Paul from the contractor's office called again. This time, I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, his voice sounded tighter. "We're being told to proceed," he said. "If there's an issue, we need to know now." I saved the message, added it to the folder. At lunch, I didn't leave the building. I sat in the break room with my salad and listened. Two people from operations stood near the microwave, talking in low voices. "Said it was cleared," one of them said. "Legal cleared it?" the other asked. "No, Brent." There was a pause. Then, "That's not how it usually works." I didn't look up. I didn't interrupt. I finished eating and threw my container away. In the afternoon, I received an email from County Records. Subject: pending review. Additional documentation requested. They wanted the missing attachments. I forwarded the request to legal with a simple note. These documents were not included in the original filing. No accusation, no explanation, just a fact. An hour later, legal replied. They asked for time. Time again. By the end of the day, it was clear that no one was going to pull the emergency brake. Not yet. The filings were still active. The authorization change still stood. The narrative internally, at least, was that this was a manageable hiccup. That was fine. I went home and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Outside, the temperature had dropped, and the heater clicked on with a dull thump. I created a second folder alongside Timeline. I named it External. Inside, I started compiling contact information: county offices, HOA board members, oversight committees, public records departments. I didn't reach out yet, I just mapped the landscape. Who talked to whom? Who had authority? Who would need to be notified if things escalated? I also did something else. I wrote out my own role description as it had existed before Tuesday. Not the sanitized version in HR files, the real one. The responsibilities I'd assumed because no one else wanted them. The informal checks I'd put in place to prevent exactly the kind of shortcut that had just been taken. Reading it back, I felt something shift. Not pride. Recognition. They hadn't removed me because I was unnecessary. They'd removed me because I was inconvenient. Wednesday arrived quietly. No new emails, no meetings, no sudden reversals. The calm was almost unsettling. At 10:22 a.m., Marlene called. "The board wants clarity," she said. "They're concerned about liability." "They should be," I said. She hesitated. "Can you explain off the record what's going on?" I chose my words carefully. I didn't speculate. I didn't accuse. I outlined the process as it should have happened, then pointed out where it hadn't. When I finished, there was silence on the line. "That's not acceptable," she said finally. "No," I agreed. "It's not. We'll need documentation," she said. "I have it," I replied. After the call, I didn't feel relief. I felt steadier, like I'd placed a foot on solid ground after stepping carefully for days. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. Because something else was becoming clear. They weren't trying to cover up a single mistake. They were trying to normalize a new way of operating, one that bypassed safeguards in favor of speed and optics. If this instance passed without consequence, it wouldn't be the last. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't about me reclaiming a role or proving I'd been wronged. If it were, the path would be simple. File a complaint, escalate internally, force a correction. But that would leave the system intact. And the system was the problem. Thursday afternoon, Brent stopped by my desk again. "Things are settling," he said, as if reporting the weather. "Legal's handling it." I nodded. "Good." He studied my face, searching for something. Anger, fear, compliance. He didn't find it. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said truthfully. He lingered a moment longer, then walked away. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in days. Not because the situation had improved, but because I'd stopped trying to resolve it prematurely. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was waiting for alignment between facts and accountability. By Friday morning, the county assessor's office sent another email. They'd placed the variance under provisional review. No work could proceed until documentation was complete. That was the first tangible pause. At 11:03 a.m., Diane sent a company-wide message. Subject: Process update. It was brief, vague. It framed the delay as routine, a scheduling issue, nothing to be concerned about. I read it once and closed it. At 2:40, my phone buzzed with a text from the unknown number that had warned me earlier. "They're nervous." I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and finalized the document I'd been drafting all week. Not a complaint. Not a demand. An account. Dates, times, actions, filings, authorizations. No adjectives. No conclusions. Just the truth, laid out in sequence. I saved it as a PDF and stared at the file name for a long moment. Then I renamed it. Record. I wasn't ready to send it yet. But I was close. Because one thing had become undeniable over the past few days. Staying silent wasn't neutral. It was permission, and I was done giving that without understanding the cost. By the following Monday, the situation had settled into a strange, suspended state. Nothing had been fixed, but nothing had exploded either. From the outside, it probably looked like a minor procedural hiccup, one of those administrative tangles that resolved itself quietly once the right people exchanged the right emails. Inside the office, though, the air had changed. Conversations lowered when I walked past. Doors closed more often. Decisions were made faster and documented less. That told me everything I needed to know. I stopped waiting for updates and started repositioning myself. Not outwardly. Not in a way anyone could point to and say, "She's gearing up for something." I kept my tone neutral, my posture relaxed. I answered emails that still came to me. I completed tasks that hadn't been stripped away yet. I showed up to the meetings I was still invited to and contributed just enough to remain unremarkable. What changed was how I listened. I paid attention to what wasn't said, to the assumptions tucked into casual phrases, to the way certain names were mentioned with a new caution, as if people were adjusting their language in real time, testing what was safe. At 9:18 a.m. on Monday, Brent held an impromptu meeting with operations. The door was closed, but the walls were thin. I didn't strain to hear. I didn't need to. What mattered was who wasn't invited. At 10:02, legal sent another update. Still reviewing, still assessing. Still no acknowledgement that a false certification had been filed. The language was careful enough to suggest they were protecting someone, but not careful enough to convince me they had a plan. At 10:47, I received a calendar invite for a meeting 2 weeks out. Subject line: Process retrospective. The invite list was long. County liaison, external counsel, HOA representatives, Diane, Brent. My name was included. That was new. I didn't respond right away. I read the invite, noted the date, and closed it. Then I opened my notebook and wrote it down. They weren't correcting the process yet. They were preparing a narrative. That afternoon, I left the office early and drove across town to meet with someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Her name was Elaine, and she'd been a senior compliance officer at a different firm back when I was still learning which battles were worth fighting. She'd left the industry a year earlier to consult independently. We met at a coffee shop near a strip mall, the kind with neutral decor and chairs that were never quite comfortable enough to encourage lingering. Elaine arrived 5 minutes late, carrying a notebook and wearing the same no-nonsense expression I remembered. "You look tired," she said after hugging me briefly. "I feel clear," I replied. We ordered coffee and sat down. I didn't start at the beginning. I started with the document. I slid my tablet across the table and let her read the record. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions. She read slowly, her finger tracing the screen as she moved through the timeline. When she finished, she leaned back and exhaled. "They bypassed controls," she said, deliberately. "Yes," I said. "And they did it in a way that implicates more than one person," she added. "Yes." She studied me. "What do you want?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that question directly. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I want this to stop," I said. "Not just here. I want it documented in a way that can't be reframed as a misunderstanding." Elaine nodded slowly. "Then you need to decide who this record is for." "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "That's okay," she said. "But you should assume that once it leaves your hands, you don't control how it's used." "I know. Unsure than to taking mine." She slid the tablet back toward me. "You've done the right thing so far. You didn't rush. You didn't escalate prematurely. That gives you credibility." "Credibility doesn't feel like much," I said. "It is when people are trying to rewrite history," she replied. We talked for another hour. Not about revenge, not about consequences, about process, oversight, the difference between internal correction and external accountability, the risks of each. By the time we stood to leave, I felt steadier than I had in days, not because I had a solution, but because I had options. Back at the office on Tuesday, the energy had shifted again. There was a sense of anticipation now, of preparation, as if everyone was aware that something was coming, even if they didn't know what shape it would take. Diane stopped by my desk mid-morning. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded. We went into a small meeting room. She closed the door and leaned against the table, arms crossed. "I want to clear the air," she said. I waited. "This wasn't meant to sideline you," she continued. It was a temporary adjustment. It was filed as permanent authority, I said calmly. She frowned. That's not how it was intended. Intent doesn't override documentation, I replied. Her jaw tightened. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. I looked at her. You made it bigger when you certified notification that didn't happen. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For a moment, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not guilty, not defensive, just unsure. We're trying to move forward, she said finally. So am I said. She searched my face, as if looking for a hint of what that meant. I didn't give her one. When she left, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. Over the next few days, I continued to do what I'd been doing all along, quietly repositioning. I finalized a summary version of the record. Shorter, tighter, still factual. I prepared an appendix with supporting screenshots and system logs. I saved everything to an encrypted drive and backed it up twice. I also did something else. I drafted a statement. Not an accusation, not a complaint, a statement of professional concern. It outlined the risks of bypassing compliance safeguards and the potential consequences for all parties involved. It didn't name names. It didn't assign motive. It focused on impact. I hadn't decided who would receive it yet. By Thursday, the county assessor's office formally suspended the variance review pending clarification. That development rippled outward. Emails increased, meetings were scheduled, voices lowered further. At 3:30 p.m., Brent called me into his office again. This has gone far enough, he said. I agree, I replied. He stared at me. Frustration etched across his face. What do you want? The question again. I want the record to reflect what actually happened, I said. And I want safeguards restored, he scoffed. You think blowing this up helps anyone? I think pretending it didn't happen helps no one, I said. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with new eyes. You're serious? Yes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he nodded once. We'll see, he said. That evening, as I packed up to leave, I felt something I hadn't felt since the beginning of the week. Control, not over the outcome, not over other people's choices, but over my own. I drove home as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky streaked with pale orange and gray. At a stoplight, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, focused, different. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew what the next step would be. I wasn't going to wait for the retrospective meeting. I wasn't going to let this be framed as a lesson learned or a process improvement. I was going to ensure that the truth existed somewhere beyond internal conversations and carefully worded emails. Not to punish, but to protect the next person who trusted the system as much as I once had. That decision didn't come with relief. It came with weight. And I carried it inside, set my bag down, and opened my laptop one more time. The record was ready. Now it was just a matter of deciding where it belonged. The invitation for the process retrospective arrived with a revised agenda attached. That alone was unusual. I opened the file at my desk on Thursday morning and read through it carefully. The language had shifted since the original invite. Where it once said review of recent events, it now read alignment on process improvements. Where it once listed variance filing as a topic, it now said communication flow. The word error didn't appear anywhere. It was clean, polished, reassuring. It was also designed to end the story. I didn't decline the meeting. I didn't ask questions. I clicked accept and added it to my calendar. Then I closed the window and went back to work. That afternoon, Brent stopped by my desk again. He didn't ask to talk privately this time. He leaned against the cubicle wall, relaxed, like someone checking in on a project that was finally back on track. Looks like we're getting this wrapped up, he said. That's what it looks like, I agreed. He nodded, satisfied. Legal's comfortable with the approach. County's been cooperative. The board wants closure. Everyone wants closure, I said. Exactly, he replied. No reason to drag this out. I watched him for a moment. He looked tired, but relieved. The kind of relief that comes when you believe a problem has been successfully contained. When he walked away, I opened my notebook and wrote down the time. Friday passed quietly. Too quietly. Emails slowed. Meetings were postponed. The urgency that had pulsed through the office earlier in the week dissipated, replaced by a collective exhale. People smiled again. Jokes resurfaced. The crisis, whatever it had been, seemed to be fading into memory. On Monday morning, legal sent a company-wide email. Subject: Compliance Review. Summary. The message was brief. It acknowledged that process gaps had been identified and outlined new internal guidelines to prevent future misalignment. It thanked teams for their cooperation and emphasized a commitment to transparency and continuous improvement. No mention of false certification. No mention of unauthorized clearance. No mention of notification that never happened. The email ended with a sentence that landed heavier than the rest. No further action is required at this time. I read it once, then again. Then I closed my laptop. At 10:30, the retrospective meeting began. The conference room was full. More people than necessary. External counsel sat at one end of the table. County liaison joined via speakerphone. Diane sat beside Brent, her posture open, attentive. I took a seat near the middle, notebook closed, pen resting untouched on top. The meeting followed the agenda precisely. There were slides, charts, timelines, carefully edited ones. The variance filing was described as premature, not improper. The authorization change was framed as accelerated, not false. The missing documentation was attributed to communication lag. Everyone nodded at the right moments. When the county liaison spoke, she thanked the company for its responsiveness and noted that the variance review would remain paused until supplemental materials were submitted. No penalties, no citations. Just a pause. The board representative echoed that sentiment. "We appreciate the clarification," she said. "We're satisfied with the steps being taken." Satisfied. I felt eyes flick toward me, briefly, expectantly. This was the moment where I was supposed to agree, to confirm that the issue had been resolved, to let the narrative close neatly, with a lesson learned and no one explicitly at fault. Brent turned to me near the end of the meeting. "Anything you'd like to add?" he asked. The room went still, not tense, just attentive. I looked around. At the familiar faces, at the people who had avoided my eyes weeks earlier and now watched me carefully, measuring what I would do. "No," I said calmly. "I think you've covered it." A ripple of relief moved through the room. "Great," Brent said, smiling. "Then I think we can consider this closed." The meeting ended 10 minutes early. People stood, chatted, collected their things. Diane leaned toward me as she passed. "See?" she said softly. "We're moving forward." "Yes," I replied. "You are." Detailing the Mong's college. That afternoon, my access to the HOA account was partially restored. Not full authority. Just view only. Enough to suggest goodwill. Enough to signal inclusion without control. An email followed shortly after. Subject: Updated role scope. It thanked me for my professionalism during a challenging period and outlined my revised responsibilities going forward. They were narrower than before. Cleaner. Less exposed. It ended with, "Please confirm receipt." I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the record. Nothing in it had changed. The facts were still the facts. The filings were still the filings. The certification was still false, no matter how carefully it had been reframed. That evening, I met Elaine again. Same coffee shop, same uncomfortable chairs. "They think it's over," she said after I summarized the meeting. "They need it to be," I replied. She nodded. "That's the false resolution. Everyone agrees to move on without addressing the underlying issue." End quote. "I know," I said. She studied me. "Are you going to let it stand?" I thought about the relief in Brent's voice. The careful language in legal's email. The way the system had bent just enough to protect itself. "No," I said. "But not the way they expect." Over the next few days, the office returned to routine. The variance remained paused, but no one seemed worried. New projects took focus. The incident faded into background noise. On Wednesday afternoon, I received a message from Paul. "Thanks for the clarification last week," he wrote. "We've been told to hold. Appreciate your professionalism." I stared at the message, then saved it to the folder. That night, I opened the statement I'd drafted earlier. the one focused on risk and impact, not blame. I read it carefully, making small edits, tightening language, removing anything that could be interpreted as emotion. When I was done, I attached the record as an appendix. I didn't send it yet. Thursday brought another small shift. The county assessor's office updated the status of the variance to under administrative review. That designation triggered an automatic notice not just to the company, but to an external oversight database that tracked compliance trends across jurisdictions. It was a small thing, technical, easy to miss. But it meant the issue now existed outside internal control. I forwarded the notice to legal with a single line. For awareness. No response came. By Friday, Brent avoided me entirely. Diane was cordial but distant. Legal stopped sending updates. The false resolution was holding, barely. That weekend, I didn't think about work. I cleaned my house, went for a long walk, watched the leaves collect along the curb. Ordinary life resumed, layered over an unresolved truth. On Sunday evening, as I packed my bag for Monday, I made my decision. I wasn't going to challenge the outcome of the retrospective. I wasn't going to argue that the meeting had been inadequate. I was going to do something quieter, something permanent. I logged into my laptop and opened my email. I typed an address I hadn't used in years, the one Elaine had suggested, almost casually, during our first meeting. An independent compliance oversight body, not an enforcement agency, not a whistleblower hotline. A professional review board that tracked patterns across organizations, looking for systemic risk. I attached the statement. I attached the record. I didn't write a cover letter. I didn't explain motives. I wrote one sentence. Submitted for independent review. Then I closed my laptop. On Monday morning, the office would continue as if nothing had happened. The meeting would be remembered as a success. The process would be considered improved. For now. What they didn't know what made this a false ending was that the story no longer belonged solely to them. It had left the building. And once it entered a system designed to see patterns instead of personalities, there would be no way to contain it with a slide deck or a carefully worded email. The calm wasn't resolution. It was the pause before consequences found their proper shape. The first sign that something had shifted came quietly, the way most real consequences do. It wasn't an email blast or an emergency meeting. It was a request. On Tuesday morning, 2 days after I'd sent the record for independent review, I received a calendar notification from an unfamiliar address. No subject line, just a meeting request labeled Information Verification, 30 minutes, video call, optional camera. I didn't accept it right away. I opened the sender details instead. The domain belonged to the oversight body Elaine had mentioned. Not enforcement, not disciplinary. The kind of organization that existed precisely because no one liked the alternative. I accepted the invite and closed my calendar. At work, nothing appeared different. People arrived with coffee. Conversations drifted toward weekend plans. Brent's door was closed, but that wasn't unusual. Diane passed my desk and nodded, professional as ever. At 10 a.m., I joined the call. There were 2 people on the screen. A man and a woman, both middle-aged, both with the calm, neutral expressions of people who had seen this kind of situation many times before. "Thank you for meeting with us," the woman said. "This is not an investigation." I nodded. I'd expected that. "This is a verification step," the man added. "We review submissions for accuracy and completeness before determining next steps." Next steps. They didn't ask me how I felt. They didn't ask why I'd submitted the record. They asked factual questions. "Can you confirm the date and time of the authorization change? Did you receive notification prior to filing? Is this system log representative of standard procedure? Who had authority to toggle the compliance clearance?" I answered calmly, referring to timestamps, attachments, and internal policy language. I didn't speculate. I didn't accuse. When the call ended, the woman thanked me again. "You may be contacted for follow-up," she said, "or you may not. Either way, you did the right thing bringing this forward." I closed my laptop and sat still for a moment. That was it. No validation, no promise, just acknowledgement. By lunchtime, the ripple had reached the office. Legal sent an email requesting an updated copy of the compliance checklist for the HOA account. Not the revised one, The original. The one in effect before the changes. That was the first crack. At 12:40 p.m., Diane emerged from a meeting with legal looking tense. She didn't stop at my desk. She walked straight to Brent's office and closed the door behind her. At 2:15, Brent called for a leadership meeting. Emergency. Mandatory. I wasn't invited. I didn't need to be. At 3:02, the county assessor's office sent a notice. Subject: Formal Administrative Inquiry, HOA Variance Filing. The body was brief and unmistakable. Due to discrepancies identified during routine review, the filing has been escalated for formal inquiry. Additional documentation and clarification will be required. Formal inquiry. That designation changed everything. It meant timelines. It meant sworn statements. It meant individual accountability. By 4 p.m., the mood in the office had shifted from relief to unease. Voices dropped again, but this time not with confidence, with calculation. People stopped smiling. Doors stayed closed. At 4:27, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Did you submit something? I stared at the screen and didn't reply. At 4:44, another message followed. This is bigger than you think. I set my phone face down and continued working. At 5:12, Brent stood at my desk. We need to talk, he said. I looked up. About what? He glanced around, then lowered his voice. This escalation, did you initiate it? I documented facts, I said. What happened after that wasn't up to me. His jaw tightened. You went outside. I went to a professional review body, I replied. That exists for situations like this. This could damage the company, he said. I met his gaze. It could protect it too. He stared at me, searching for something. Regret, perhaps. Fear. Compliance. What do you want? He asked quietly. The question again. Always too late. I want safeguards restored, I said. And I want the record to reflect what actually happened. That's not how this works, he snapped. That's exactly how it works, I said. Just not on your timeline. He exhaled sharply and stepped back. We'll be in touch, he said, then turned and walked away. That evening, an internal memo went out. Subject: Temporary process suspension. It announced a pause on all variance filings pending review. It framed the decision as proactive, voluntary, and aligned with best practices. It also announced the formation of an internal review committee. Brent's name was not on it. Diane's wasn't either. The following morning, legal requested individual interviews with anyone who had touched the HOA account in the past 6 months. That included me, and it included them. Over the next week, the unraveling happened slowly, then all at once. Emails were reviewed, system logs examined, statements compared. What had been presented as a streamlined decision revealed itself as a chain of shortcuts, each one justified, each one initialed, each one designed to bypass friction in favor of speed and image. The oversight body followed up with a second call. This is now a pattern review, the man said. Not an isolated incident. Pattern. That word landed harder than any accusation. It meant this wasn't just about one filing, or one HOA, or one decision made under pressure. It meant the system itself had been compromised. By Friday, the county assessor's office issued a notice of non-compliance. No fine yet. Just a finding, public record. By Monday, an external auditor was retained. By Wednesday, Diane was placed on administrative leave. Her out-of-office message was brief and vague. Brent lasted another week. His departure was announced quietly, framed as a mutual decision. No details, no explanation. The office absorbed it the way organizations always do, quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. Work continued. New interim leadership stepped in, processes were reviewed, safeguards reinstated. No one apologized to me. I didn't expect them to. Because this twist, this ending wasn't about vindication. It wasn't about watching the people who sidelined me fall. It was about something else entirely. The truth had outgrown the room where it had been buried. It had moved into systems that didn't care about personalities or power dynamics, systems that looked at patterns, risks, and consequences. And once it was there, no amount of careful language or controlled meetings could pull it back. One afternoon, Marlene called. You did the right thing, she said. This would have happened again. To someone else. I looked out the window at the parking lot, at the same beige cars and familiar faces moving through ordinary days. That's why I did it, I said. The cost hadn't been personal destruction or public humiliation. It had been something quieter. The cost was that the version of the workplace that relied on silence could no longer exist. And the thing they had underestimated, what made this different from the last story they'd told themselves, was simple. I hadn't spoken up to save myself. I had spoken up to stop the system from deciding who would be next. After the announcements, the office didn't collapse the way people imagine institutions do when something goes wrong. There were no shouted arguments in hallways, no dramatic resignations, no whispered alliances forming overnight. What happened instead was quieter, slower, and in some ways more unsettling. The system adjusted. New procedures were rolled out with familiar efficiency. Checklists were reintroduced. Approval thresholds were clarified. Language that had disappeared from internal documents, words like verification, segregation of duties, independent review returned as if they'd simply been misplaced for a while. The tone of emails shifted, becoming more careful, more deliberate. Fewer assumptions, more citations. On paper, it looked like progress. In practice, it felt like grief. Not my grief, the organization's. People don't mourn the loss of wrongdoing, they mourn the loss of ease. The shortcuts that made things move faster, the quiet understandings that kept uncomfortable questions at bay. When those vanish, what's left is friction, and friction forces people to notice what they're doing. On the Monday after Brent's departure was announced, a new interim director held a town hall. She spoke plainly, without slides. She acknowledged the recent changes and emphasized a renewed commitment to process integrity. "We're not here to assign blame," she said. "We're here to restore trust." Trust. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. No one asked questions. No one clapped. When the meeting ended, people filed out quietly. A few nodded at me as they passed. Not warmly, not coldly, just acknowledging that I was there. That was new. My own role changed again, this time formally. I was asked to consult on the redesign of compliance workflows temporarily, they said. To provide continuity, to help ensure that safeguards were practical, not just performative. I agreed, not because I needed validation, but because I knew how easily safeguards could be written in a way that looked good and failed quietly later. If they were going to rebuild, I wanted the bones to be strong. The days settled into a different rhythm. Slower, more cautious, less improvisation disguised as decisiveness. Meetings ran longer because people asked questions they hadn't bothered with before. Some found that frustrating. Others seemed relieved. Diane's name stopped appearing in email chains. Her office door remained closed, then empty. No one talked about her directly. Her absence was treated like a fact of nature, something acknowledged and then worked around. Brent's departure was absorbed even more efficiently. His responsibilities were redistributed, his projects reassigned. His influence faded faster than I'd expected. Power leaves quietly when it's no longer protected. One afternoon, I received a message from legal asking for clarification on an old policy interpretation. The question was careful, precise. It acknowledged ambiguity and asked for guidance. I answered it with a citation and a short explanation. At the end, I added a sentence I'd never felt comfortable writing before. If there's uncertainty, it's better to pause than to proceed without verification. They replied with a thank you and incorporated the language into the draft. That was the new normal. Outside the office, the consequences rippled outward in smaller ways. The HOA board issued a brief statement to residents, explaining the delay in approvals and reaffirming their commitment to compliance. The county assessor's office closed the inquiry after corrective actions were documented. No fines were issued, no headlines followed. From the outside, it looked like a resolved issue. Inside, the memory lingered. People were more careful about who they copied on emails, about what they certified, about what they assumed someone else had already checked. That caution wasn't fear, it was awareness. The kind that comes after you realize a system can fail quietly if everyone agrees not to look too closely. One evening, as I was packing up to leave, Josh, the coworker who'd asked if I was okay weeks earlier, stopped by my desk. I wanted to say something, he said. I looked up. Okay, actuode. I didn't know what was going on at the time, he continued. But I'm glad someone noticed. I nodded. Me too. He hesitated, then added, it made me look at some of my own assumptions. After he left, I sat there for a moment, thinking about that. Assumptions are comfortable. They let you move quickly. They also let you miss things that matter. At home, life continued much as it always had. I cooked dinner, did laundry, went for walks in the evening as the air cooled and the lights softened. Friends asked how work was. I gave them the short version. It was a weird few weeks, I said, but it's settling. That was true, in a way. What I didn't say, what I couldn't easily explain, was that something fundamental had shifted for me as well. Not in my confidence, not in my sense of right and wrong. In my expectations. I no longer believed that systems corrected themselves just because they were designed to. I'd seen how easily they could be bent by convenience and protected by silence. I'd also seen how difficult it was to restore them once that bending became routine. That awareness came with a kind of quiet responsibility. One afternoon, the oversight body emailed me again, not with an update or a request, just a note. Thank you for your cooperation. The review has been closed. Closed. I read the message and archived it. The record would remain in their system, tagged and searchable, part of a pattern that might one day connect to something else. That was enough. Weeks later, during a training session for new hires, the interim director referenced a hypothetical scenario, a compliance shortcut, a missing approval, a decision made under pressure. What would you do? She asked the room. Hands went up, people answered cautiously, thoughtfully. Someone mentioned escalation. Someone else mentioned documentation. Someone said, I'd pause. I watched from the back of the room, unnoticed, and felt something like relief. Not because I'd been proven right, but because the conversation itself had changed. There was no grand acknowledgement of what had happened, no apology tour, no plaque or commendation. That wasn't the currency of this kind of outcome. The real aftermath was subtler. It lived in the extra questions people asked before clicking submit, in the way authority was checked instead of assumed, in the understanding that silence was no longer the default response to discomfort. One evening, as I locked up and headed to my car, Marlene called. The board voted unanimously on the revised oversight structure, she said. Your recommendations were included. That's good, I said. She paused. You know this wasn't just about us, right? Yes, I said. This will change how other boards handle similar situations, she added. We've already gotten calls. I leaned against my car, the metal cool under my palm. Then it was worth it. After we hung up, I sat behind the wheel for a moment, watching the sun dip behind the buildings across the street. The parking lot lights flickered on, one by one. The cost of speaking up hadn't been personal ruin or professional exile. It had been discomfort, uncertainty, a stretch of days where the outcome wasn't guaranteed and the easy path was to stay quiet. The payoff wasn't triumph. It was something more durable, a system that would hesitate before cutting corners again. And the knowledge that when silence becomes the safest option for those in power, breaking it calmly, precisely, and with evidence, is sometimes the only way to restore balance. Not for applause, not for revenge, but so the next person doesn't have to wonder whether doing everything right will still leave them erased. The story didn't end with a celebration or a clean sense of victory. It ended the way most real shifts do, gradually, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize the ground under your feet is no longer the same. By the time winter settled in, the office had fully absorbed the changes. The interim director was made permanent. The review committee dissolved itself after issuing a final set of recommendations. The word temporary disappeared from internal memos. Processes hardened into policy. Policy hardened into habit. People stopped talking about what happened last fall, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been integrated, like a scar that no longer hurt but still altered how you moved. My own role stabilized. I wasn't elevated. I wasn't sidelined. I was placed exactly where I was most effective inside the system, but no longer invisible to it. My access was restored properly, with documentation this time. My name returned to the headers it belonged in, not as a favor, as a fact. That distinction mattered more than I expected. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a draft policy with a junior analyst, she hesitated over a line about discretionary authority. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," I replied. "How do you know when to trust the process?" she asked, "and when to question it?" I thought about that for a moment. "You trust the process when it leaves room for questions," I said. "You question it when it asks you not to ask any." She nodded slowly and made a note in the margin. That interaction stayed with me, not because it felt significant at the time, but because it reflected something deeper. The culture had shifted just enough that people felt permitted to ask how things worked, not just whether they were allowed to. Outside of work, life continued in its familiar patterns. I still woke up early, still drove the same route, still poured coffee into the same chipped mug. The world hadn't rearranged itself to reward me for doing what I'd done. And I didn't need it to. What had changed was internal. I no longer mistook quiet for fairness, or efficiency for integrity. I no longer assumed that systems corrected themselves if left alone. I understood now that systems did exactly what the people inside them allowed, no more, no less. That understanding didn't make me cynical. It made me precise. Months later, I ran into Diane at a grocery store on the other side of town. I almost didn't recognize her at first. She looked tired, smaller somehow. Not defeated, just unguarded. We stood awkwardly near the produce section, both holding baskets. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I replied. There was a pause. The hum of refrigerators filled the space between us. "I wanted to say," she began, then stopped. I didn't realize how far it had gone. I looked at her, really looked. Not at the version of her who'd smiled in meetings or rewritten narratives, but at the person standing there, uncertain and human. "I know," I said. She nodded, relief flickering across her face. "I hope you're doing well." "I am," I said, and I meant it. We parted without drama, without closure, without absolution. That, too, felt appropriate. On a quiet evening not long after, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing an unrelated document. Outside, snow fell in slow, steady sheets, muffling the neighborhood. The porch light cast a soft glow across the yard. I paused and looked around my house. The same furniture, the same walls, the same life I'd had before all of this began. But the way I occupied it had changed. I thought about the version of myself from months earlier, the woman who believed that doing everything right would protect her by default. The woman who mistook silence for professionalism and patience for safety. She hadn't been weak. She'd just been taught the wrong lesson. The real lesson wasn't that speaking up always leads to justice, or that systems will reward you for integrity. It was simpler and harder. Silence doesn't preserve fairness. It preserves momentum. And momentum, once it tilts in the wrong direction, doesn't correct itself. It just keeps going until something interrupts it. That interruption doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't even have to be personal. It just has to be documented. One morning, I received an email from the oversight body, not a follow-up, but a general bulletin. It outlined anonymized trends they'd identified across multiple organizations, repeated patterns, familiar shortcuts. The same language I'd seen before, stripped of names and contexts. My situation wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. I forwarded the bulletin to a few colleagues with a short note. Worth reading. No explanation, no commentary. Just information, passed along. That was the final shift, the one that confirmed the story was truly over. Not because everything had been fixed, but because the responsibility no longer sat on my shoulders alone. The knowledge had spread. The awareness had dispersed. The system had learned, not because it wanted to, but because it had been made to see itself clearly. On my last walk of the year, I bundled up and headed down the familiar street as the sun dipped low. The air was sharp, the sky pale and wide. My breath rose in small clouds with each step. I thought about how easy it would have been to stay quiet, to accept the revised role, to let the false resolutions stand. Nothing catastrophic would have happened to me, but something would have continued to happen to others. That was the part that mattered. Justice, I learned, isn't always about restoring what was taken from you. Sometimes, it's about making sure the thing that hurt you doesn't become standard practice for the next person who walks through the door, believing the rules apply equally. I reached the corner and turned back toward home, my boots crunching softly on the snow. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't lost everything. What I'd done instead was change the conditions under which harm could quietly repeat itself, and that was enough. Because the truth I carry with me now, the one that reshaped how I see systems, work, and my own responsibility is this: doing the right thing doesn't guarantee protection, but refusing to document the wrong one guarantees repetition. I turned onto my street as the porch light flicked on automatically, steady and reliable. Not because it knew I was coming, but because it had been set up to do its job, regardless of who walked into its reach. That, finally, felt like justice.